I've had enough of this. Please say something to...
I was already at my limit and couldn't take any more.
What are you saying all of a sudden? I've been asking you about this for times now. You need to say something to your brother.
I confronted my husband, Bob, about his brother-in-law, Stephen, staying at our house.
You want me to kick my brother out house with nowhere to go? How can you say that when you're my brother-in-law?
That's right. You really are the worst kind of person.
Not only did my husband come at me, but even my mother-in-law, Lily, blamed me. This is a story of my experience of involved with an unbelievable family. My name is Emily. I married my current husband, Bob, 28 years old. We met through an arranged marriage. When I was a student, I was so absorbed in the tennis club, which I had played since childhood, and I wasn't interested in any romantic relationships. I spent every day in club activities, trying to also keep up with my studies, which I was too busy to be in a relationship. Of course, it's not that I had no desire to get married or anything like that. However, having never been in a relationship before, I didn't know how to build a relationship with a man. And even after starting to work, I was still unable. My boss at work, who couldn't stand like that, told me that he knew and introduced me to Bob. My first impression of him was that kind man. He works for the government and seemed calm and peaceful. Since he liked me and I wanted to get married by the time I was 30, I immediately accepted his offer to be a couple. Afterwards, we got along very well, soon fell seriously in love with each. I especially liked his sincerity and kindness, and I thought I could marry him. After a while, he proposed to me, and I immediately accepted and got engaged. We were able to get married without any problems. When Bob and I decided to get married, our parents, who were wealthy and owned houses as vacation homes, gave us one of their houses. They gave me the option to choose what I wanted, and I chose a house that was just right, not too big and not too small. I chose a house which was just a little bigger than a normal house. The house had enough room for our child in the future and also a garden. It was convenient for transportation. It was close to the bus station, and there was no inconvenience as markets were close by, which is why I also chose it. I still remember Bob, who doesn't often show his emotions, saying in an odd tone, "Wow, can we really go to a great house?" I had no doubt that our happy life to begin. After that, the wedding was over and everything was going well for us. However, a few months later, my father-in-law, who had been suffering from a chronic illness, passed away. My husband had one younger brother, but he lived and worked at a factory in another state, so we never saw him regular basis. And the second time I saw Stephen was at my father-in-law's funeral. After my father-in-law passed away, I was left alone at home. Bob began to visit my mother-in-law, Lily, frequently. At the same time, Lily started coming over to our house frequently. It's true that Bob was the eldest, and perhaps he felt a certain amount of responsibility as the eldest son. It wasn't hard to understand why he worried about Lily, who was left alone while she was busy with work at the time, and the only place where I could relax. So I was a little concerned that Elle, sitting there when I came home, and this had been going on for months, and one day, my husband suggested his idea.
Hey, Emily, I'm thinking about having with us at our home.
What?
I was very confused at my husband's idea.
Even now, Lily comes over almost ever.
Say that to him, and he'll say, "I don't know."
It must be hard for her to come all here every time, though, isn't it? So I think it would be better if we together.
Bob says, with his bright sparkle. It seems as if he had just come up best idea of his lifetime.
Wait a minute. I don't like it when you say things all of a sudden. We have our own lives and lifestyle.
I try to back up my point, but he says,
I mean, this house is too big for just two of us, isn't it? We have plenty of rooms, and I think it would be helpful to Mom if we lived together.
he said that, and it seemed like he didn't want to listen to my opinion. I didn't really give him a concrete answer, but Bob kept on going on, and if anything had happened, he would have said that I was responsible for leaving Mom alone. To me, it seemed like he was just trying to make himself feel better by blaming someone else. I honestly wasn't too keen on the idea of having a baby so soon after getting married, but when Bob told me that Lily was in trouble, I couldn't refuse to help. While I was trying to avoid giving a definite answer, Lily sold their family home half-forced into a situation where she had no choice but to accept my offer of living in our house. At first, I blamed Bob for proceeding with everything without my agreement. When he said, "I'm sorry, but we have to move forward," I felt betrayed and angry. We don't have my parents' house anymore, and my mom has nowhere to live, so we chose to rent out the house instead of selling it. I kind of lost interest in talking back to him. After that, life was very difficult. I wasn't harassed or bullied. I just didn't like being told you're right about everything, and I felt like my opinions were constantly dismissed.
You are married to my son, so you serve your husband's family.
She had an old-fashioned way of thinking, and when I prioritized my work, she would often tell me, "You're the daughter-in-law, so you should be making yourself useful." But since Lily came over to our house, I became too lazy to stay at home and spent many days working overtime at the office. I was still living an ordinary life, with sarcastic remarks from Lily in my ear every day, until that incident happened. Sometime later, my brother-in-law, who had been living and working at a factory in another state, announced that he was going to quit his job at the end of the year. Bob and Lily and I were surprised at Stephen's sudden announcement. But we had more important things to think about. We had to think more about where he'd come back to. Their parents' house had already been sold, and he could no longer live there as he wished. When Stephen, who was ready to come his parents' house, came back here, Bob and Lily, for selling the house any notice while he was gone.
Hey, I haven't heard anything about the sale. What the hell are you doing?
Stephen used to be in a gang, and his were pretty flashy and also had a V tone of voice. I had never been involved with that person before, and to be honest, I was very good at it and wanted to see him as much as possible.
I'm sorry, but I was worried about her being alone in that house. I thought you were going to live and work over there for a long time, too.
My husband tried to calm him down.
What? What the hell? How dare you decide it all on your... You better take responsibility for...
He yells at Bob. Bob is supposed to be his eldest brother, but he just freaked out when Stephen started yelling at him. In the end, he couldn't say anything, just looked down with a pale face. My father-in-law had said before he died that if anything happened to him, he would leave all the affairs of the house to Lily. Stephen, who had left his parents' home without permission, worked out of state, and did not send any money, had no right to Lily and her family. That's what I thought in my mind. But at the end, we couldn't come to an agreement. Stephen ended up moving in with us, or condition that he would stay with us. I was completely against it and came up with a better idea.
I can't have Stephen living with us. Now that Lily has come to live with us, our living expenses have been increasing.
I complained to Bob, but he said he'd leave as soon as he found another job, so I had to put up with it until then. I couldn't just refuse Stephen and Rito. I move out all on my own, so I had choice but to have Stephen move in W. The time being, at this point, my mentality was already shattered. But the real hard part came when I had to face the reality of what happened. Firstly, Stephen hadn't attempted to find a new job even after a month, which was surprising as he was supposed to have found one by now. He didn't even look at any job listings, didn't go to job interviews, and spent his days lounging around in the room. Some days, he would stay in his room, listening to loud music, and other days, he would spend himself with the TV in the living room for hours, and seeing that, I was getting worried. To top it all off, I had just come from work, and he would ask me, "Where's my shirt?" Or, "I'll be the first one to take a quick shower." I just couldn't stand this any longer and complained to Bob about it.
Hey, it's about Steven. Can't you do something about his attitude because he's treating me like his housekeeper?
What do you mean, housekeeper? He thinks of you as his own sister, adores you in his own way.
Bob says this as he laughs away.
Adores me? No way. He orders me to do things, you know? This is just like being his housekeeper. I'm not a servant in this house, you...
When I got very emotional, he said, "It's okay, Emily. You're my whole world." My anger peaked as he said so. "I'm only your wife, not your wife." And I ended up yelling at him.
Sigh. Please don't make a big deal this. You're right, Emily. You're not his... It won't change the fact that he's little brother, right? Please don't be a hassle and just make it work with him somehow.
That's what he says to me. I was disappointed in what Bob had. He seemed to think that if I was the in the house who had to put up with everything would be all right. Bob seemed to think so. I thought that there was nothing more to say to Bob, so I stopped complaining to Stephen and Lily about it. Instead, I would occasionally call and complain to them. My father and mother both told me that I could always come home if I needed to, as long as I was able to put up with it. But then one day, Stephen had caused incident. When I returned home after work, a truck parked in front of our house. When I wondered what was going on, firefighters came out of the front. I saw Bob and Lily thanking them. After seeing the fire trucks leave, I questioned Bob.
What is the meaning of this? Why were the firefighters at our house?
Bob and Lily looked at each other and awkwardly started to tell what happened.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by edit, but I can certainly help with any spelling or grammar mistake. Stephen was smoking, and the cigarette from his cigarette caused a fire.
What?
I let out a loud voice in surprise. When I asked for more details, they said that a cigarette butt had started the fire and that Lily had quickly contacted the fire department. I couldn't understand why they didn't let me in. It was a good thing that I returned. The firefighters were leaving, but come home without seeing what was G. Were they going to keep it a secret? I asked them that, but they both remained silent. Irritated by the two of them, I hurried to Stephen's room and entered it without knocking.
What? Hey. You better knock.
I ignored Stephen, who was so angry, and I looked around the room. I immediately noticed the burn marks floor right next to where his bed mat was. Ever since Stephen arrived, the house has been filled with cigarette smoke, which is not good for my health. And to top it off, he had left burn my favorite house, and I was at the patience. Even though I was right in front of Stephen, I couldn't care less. I was already at my limit and couldn't take any more. Then Bob says, "What are you saying suddenly?"
This isn't all of a sudden.
I confronted my husband, Bob, about his brother-in-law, Stephen, leaving the house. Then Bob sighs deeply and says with tone,
You want me to kick my brother out house with nowhere to go? How can you say that when you're my brother-in-law?
He began to say this.
That's right. You really are the worst kind of perk.
Not only did my husband come at me, but even my mother-in-law blamed me. Lily came at me as if it was all my fault. Why am I the one being blamed? Originally, this was a gift from my dearest father. Lily and Stephen, who came to live here without my permission, were in no see complain, let alone my husband. I knew I couldn't back down this, Tin told Stephen clearly. I want you to...
How could you? Are you saying that you want to kick your brother-in-law out of our house?
With that, he left the room. Stephen was watching this whole thing, grin on his face. I was so frustrated that I went back to my room. The next day, when I came home from key to the front door, wouldn't fit. No matter how many times I tried, it wouldn't fit into the keyhole. And there was no response when I pressed the door. Then a notification on my phone rang, alerting me that there was a message from Bob. I changed the locks for the house. That was what his message said. Don't be ridiculous. If you're being like this, then I won. With that in mind, I went back to my house and explained the situation mother and father. My parents' faces grew increasingly after they heard what I had to say. Father said, "Leave the rest to me, hired a lawyer who knew my father, warrior who knew my father was sick." Things progressed rapidly, and I soon received a demand for alimony and divorce, as evidenced by a certified letter ordering me to leave the house. As soon as we began to discuss, Bob to the idea of divorce by saying, "Divorce over something as trivial or ridiculous." But when I told him I wouldn't agree to divorce, he threatened to take me to court, and with that, perhaps he was overwhelmed by the WC court, and Bob suddenly began to question his own abilities as a coach. But when the subject of moving out house came up, he started to get agitated again, raising his voice.
This house is our home. As a husband, I have the right to expect my wife to be faithful.
Bob looks down at me with his nose as if to say, "I told you so." Then the lawyer pulls out the registration certificate and says, "This is a copy of the registration certificate issued by the Registrar of Companies in respect of your company.
You don't have any rights to this home.
Indeed, this house was given to me by my father as a gift quite some time ago. So, in other words, the house is not joint property, but it is solely owned by you." I could see the faces of Bob, Lily, Stephen turning pale as they learned truth. Perhaps they thought they would never be kicked out of the house, but they're gradually turned grim.
Emily, why don't you reconsider your decision for a moment?
He always says convenient things whenever it's not the best situation for him.
What would you like to do?
The lawyer asked me, "Will you have a divorce?" And I replied, "I don't care if I will have one." The three of them were devastated by the result, and Bob, perhaps thinking there was nothing more he could do, agreed to a divorce which was finalized. Bob, Lily, and Stephen moved out of. Bob, who worked in the government, was paying alimony that he could not afford to live as he had before, and the three moved into a rundown apartment. Of course, Lily and Stephen were strained because they couldn't live freely. Stephen, he tried to release his stress outside the house, and I heard that he even went for a walk in the park sometimes. Well, anyway, they have nothing to worry about anymore. I got my house back safely and restored the room where Stephen used to live in. The burn marks on the floor that worried me have disappeared nicely. My mood has brightened. Now my parents come to stay once a weekend, and we're going our own way. I went to a dinner with the lawyer who was handling my case afterward to thank him for his help, and we have been seeing each other regularly since then. Perhaps one day I will be able to return to a married life again. With this thought in my mind, I live every day.